The summer Elliot Danforth turned 11, he became the joke of Knox County. Not a mean joke, just the kind that spreads quietly through small towns when someone does something nobody can explain. It started at Floyd Pete's farm on a Tuesday morning in May of 1962. Elliot walked up the gravel drive with his father's old two-wheeled cart, knocked on the door, and asked if he could have the broken wagon wheels piled behind the machine shed. Floyd Pete looked at the boy, then at the wheels, then back at the boy. "Son," he said, "those things are worthless." Elliot said he knew, and asked again anyway. Word traveled the way it always does in farming country. By the following week, every neighbor within riding distance had heard about the Danforth boy collecting broken wagon wheels, the ones with shattered spokes, cracked hubs, bent iron rims so rust-eaten they looked like they'd been dug out of the creek bed. Burl Tatum, who ran the largest operation in the area and had an opinion on most things, summed it up at the grain elevator one afternoon. "Boys hauling trash home like it's gold," he said. "Danforth family ought to have a word with him." They did, several times. It didn't change anything, because what nobody in Knox County understood, not yet, was that every broken wheel Elliot brought home had a reason, and the old shed behind the Danforth barn was slowly filling with something that would eventually make every one of those people go very, very quiet. If you believe in stories about forgotten wisdom, people who saw value where others saw waste, and the patience it takes to be right when everyone around you says you're wrong, you belong in this community. Subscribe and stay close, because these stories are just getting started. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to know you're out there. The broken wheels started arriving at the Danforth farm in the spring of 1962, and they didn't stop for 3 years. Most farms in Knox County had been running tractors since the late 1940s. The horse-drawn equipment that had worked those fields for a generation had been pushed into fence corners, left to weather out in the open, or simply abandoned in the tall weeds behind barns nobody used anymore. Wagon wheels rotted, iron rusted. Nobody thought twice about them. Nobody except Elliot. He knocked on the door of every farm within 3 miles. Some families gave him wheels without a second thought, grateful for the excuse to clear the clutter. One man made him work a full Saturday morning in exchange for 4 cracked wheels. A widow near the county road gave him 6 she'd been meaning to burn for 2 winters running. He loaded them all, hauled them home, stacked them carefully inside the old shed that hadn't been properly used since his grandfather passed away. He kept the shed padlocked. He told nobody what was inside, and every time someone laughed, Elliot Danforth just nodded politely and went back to work. Elliot was not the sharpest student in his class, and he was the first to admit it. He was slow with arithmetic and couldn't spell worth a lick. What he had, the thing that set him apart, was something his grandfather had built into him over years of quiet afternoons in that same shed. Clement Danforth had worked as a wheelwright for 4 decades. He had learned the craft from his own father in the era when wagon wheels kept American farms alive. He understood wood the way most men understood the back of their own hands. He could glance at a cross-section of a spoke and tell you the species, the grain direction, whether it had dried right before it hit the lathe. He passed all of it to Elliot, not through lectures, but through work. On winter afternoons when the fields were frozen and there was nothing to do outside, Clement would bring out a cracked spoke and walk the boy through why it had failed, where the stress had traveled through the grain, what the brake told you about the load the wheel had been carrying. He showed Elliot how to read a wheel's history through its damage, the way a doctor reads a patient. "A broken thing is trying to tell you something," Clement used to say. "Most people just throw it away before it finishes talking." Clement died in the winter of 1960, when Elliot was 9. He left no money, no tools of particular value, but he had given the boy a way of seeing that no one in Knox County thought to look for in an 11-year-old dragging wagon wheels home in a cart. Here is something almost nobody in Knox County understood about those broken wagon wheels. The wood inside them was not ordinary lumber. Wheelwrights had spent generations selecting specific species for specific parts, not out of tradition, but because nothing else survived the demands of a fully loaded farm wagon. The spokes were almost always American hickory. Hickory is one of the toughest hardwoods on the continent. It bends under stress before it snaps. It absorbs the shock of rutted roads and heavy loads in ways that oak or pine simply cannot match. By the 1960s, finding sound hickory in the dimensions old-time wheelwrights had used was nearly impossible through commercial suppliers. Most had stopped stocking it years earlier. The hubs, the thick center blocks that bore the axle, were typically black locust or elm. Both species resist splitting under rotational stress in ways that most other hardwoods cannot match even today. And then there was the iron. The metal rims banding pre-war wagon wheels were wrought iron, not the mild steel that replaced it after World War II. Wrought iron is fibrous, workable, and when it's sound, it can be reforged and shaped in ways that modern steel doesn't easily allow. To a working blacksmith or restoration craftsman, it was genuinely worth having. A broken wagon wheel, to someone who knew what Clement Danforth had taught his grandson, was rarely entirely broken. A wheel with 5 shattered spokes still had 7 sound ones. A cracked hub might yield half sections worth keeping. A bent iron rim could be cut, measured, and put to use. Elliot wasn't collecting garbage. He was collecting raw materials that no hardware store in Knox County carried anymore. The question nobody thought to ask, the one that would have changed everything sooner, was what, exactly, he planned to build. By early 1964, the Danforth farm was in a tight season. Raymond Danforth, Elliot's father, was not a man given to panic, but a poor corn harvest the previous fall had left the family short on cash, and he'd taken a small loan from the county bank in February to cover operating costs. The kind of loan that changes the way a man reads his mail. At Sunday dinner in March, Uncle Warren brought up the shed. Warren meant well. He was a practical man who didn't enjoy watching his brother's family struggle. He suggested, quietly but directly, that whatever was stored in that shed might as well be sold for scrap or burned for firewood. Elliot said nothing at the table. But that night, he went back to the shed by lantern light and worked for 2 hours. He had been doing 3 things in there simultaneously: sorting, separating hickory spokes from ash, black locust hubs from elm, sound iron from rust, too far gone, harvesting, stripping the best components from wheels too damaged to save, and rebuilding, assembling complete, sound wheels from the best parts of a dozen broken ones. Not every wheel earned full restoration. Others simply gave up their usable spokes, their hubs, their iron, and their sound timber to the ones that could be made whole. And there was one more thing happening inside that shed that nobody knew about. The notebook. The notebook had belonged to Clement Danforth. Small, cloth-covered, about 100 pages. Elliot had been filling it with numbers for 2 years. Diameters, spoke counts, hub bore sizes, rim widths and thicknesses. Every rebuilt wheel was measured, cataloged, and paired with a matching wheel in careful handwriting. Why the measurements? Why restore only certain wheels while stripping others for parts? Why refuse to sell even the best rebuilt ones when opportunity knocked? In the summer of 1964, a neighbor offered Elliot $3 for one of the completed wheels standing in the shed. $3 was real money for a farm boy that year. Elliot turned it down without explaining why. His sister May, who was 15 and sharp as a tack about practical matters, nearly lost her patience. "You turned down $3 for a wheel we got for free," she said. "What exactly are you waiting for?" "Pairs," Elliot said. May stared at him. "What?" "They have to match. A wagon needs matched sets. I'm not breaking up a pair." She walked away, shaking her head. What she didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Elliot had spent the previous winter writing letters. Careful, specific letters to Amish woodworking communities in Holmes County, an hour and a half east, to a living history museum in Indiana that had recently inquired about authentic wagon components through the county agricultural extension office, and to a restoration workshop in Pennsylvania that advertised in the back of a farming almanac. He had asked each of them one simple question: if he could supply complete, matched, period-authentic wagon wheel sets in sound working condition, would they buy? The responses were folded in a coffee tin on the shelf above the workbench. The winter of 1964 hit the Danforth place harder than anyone expected. A pipe burst in January and knocked out the pump house for 3 days in below-freezing weather. Fixing it cost money the family hadn't planned to spend. Raymond came home from town looking older than he had in the fall. In February, a section of the shed roof buckled under ice load and had to be shored up from the inside. Elliot fixed it himself over 2 weekends, refusing any help so nobody had cause to come inside. He worked in the cold with his breath fogging in the lantern light, propping the sagging beam with a length of timber salvaged from an old fence post. The mocking across the county had mostly gone quiet by now, not out of respect, but because people had simply filed the Danforth boy away as a harmless eccentric and moved on to other things. But the tension at home was real and growing. In March, Raymond sat down across from Elliot at the kitchen table after supper and asked him directly, "Is there anything in that shed worth keeping?" Elliot held his father's eyes for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Give me until May." Raymond Danforth was not a man who gave trust lightly, but he had grown up watching his own father work with his hands, and he recognized something in his son's face that he couldn't find a word for. Something that looked less like hope and more like certainty. He gave him until May, the 15th of May, 1965. Elliot pulled both shed doors open himself, wide, and stepped back. Raymond came first, then Warren, who had driven out that morning half expecting to spend the afternoon hauling away scrap. Mace stood at the edge of the doorway with her arms crossed, ready for whatever this turned out to be. It took a moment to understand what they were looking at. The shed was organized, not crammed, organized, the way a man arranges a workshop when he knows exactly what he's doing and why every single piece matters. Along the left wall, 14 rebuilt wagon wheels stood upright in wooden cradles Elliot had built from salvaged fence posts. Each wheel was whole, tight spokes, sound hubs, iron rims reseated and cold hammered back to true round. Each one was labeled in Elliot's handwriting and paired precisely with its match. 7 complete sets, ready to mount. Along the back wall, sorted bins held graded components, hickory spokes bundled by length, hub blanks stacked by species, iron rim sections measured and carefully stored. On the workbench near the window sat the notebook and the coffee tin. Warren reached over and lifted the lid off the tin without asking. Inside were 6 letters, folded neatly. 3 from Amish buyers in Holmes County, offering $18 per matched pair. 1 from the Indiana Museum, willing to pay $40 for 2 period authentic sets to mount on their working farm exhibit. And 1 from the Pennsylvania Restoration Shop, expressing interest in a standing supply arrangement for premium hardwood wheel components. Warren read every letter twice. He set them down on the workbench and looked at the shed again, at the 14 wheels standing in their cradles, at the sorted bins along the back wall, at 3 years of quiet, deliberate work done by a boy the whole county had written off as a fool. "When did you write these?" he finally asked. "Last winter," Elliot said. "You had buyers before you finished the wheels." "Yes, sir." "How much?" Raymond asked. Elliot told him the total he expected to receive. The shed went very quiet. The number was enough to retire the bank loan, with enough remaining to matter going into the fall. Nobody laughed. The Danforth farm didn't become famous after that May morning. That was never what the work had been about. Elliot built a small, steady trade over the following 2 years, supplying matched wheel sets and premium hardwood components to Amish craftsmen, restoration shops, and living history museums across 3 states. He kept his eyes open at farm sales and estate auctions across the county, always stopping at the wheels that other buyers walked right past. Burl Tatum, who had first called him wheel crazy 3 years before, pulled his truck into the Danforth lane one afternoon in the fall of 1966 with 2 cracked wheels loaded in the bed. He asked what Elliot figured they were worth. Elliot walked around them slowly, pressed his thumb against the spokes, checked the grain, looked at where they had fractured and what that said about the wood that remained. "Hickory's still sound in most of this," he said. "I can use them." He paid Tatum a fair price. Neither of them mentioned what had been said 3 years earlier. They didn't need to. There is a lesson in what Elliot Danforth did that goes well beyond wagon wheels or old sheds, or even the particular wisdom of a grandfather who worked wood for 40 years. He saw value in what his community had already judged worthless. He didn't argue with them, he didn't try to explain himself before the evidence was ready. He simply kept working, quietly and patiently, until the truth spoke loud enough to be heard without him saying a word. Liberty Hyde Bailey, one of America's greatest agricultural thinkers and the man who shaped how an entire generation learned to see the land, believed that the most important quality a farmer could develop was not strength or speed, but the willingness to observe, to look at something ordinary long enough to understand what it actually was. Elliot Danforth never read Bailey, but he had learned the same lesson from an old man with a cracked spoke and a lantern in a cold winter shed. The world is full of broken wheels. The question is whether you're paying close enough attention to see what's still worth keeping.